you often don't know, we are able to bring speakers like Dr. Edie to campus through an NEH grant, a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, secured by us through Mike Chee, Barry Malone, and Jim Nielsen of the English department. We give them a brief round of applause for giving the grant. And then our speaker for today, Carolyn Edie, author of the Woman War Correspondent, U.S. Military and the Press, 1846 to 1947. Out of Lexington Books, she teaches journalism at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. She was named Outstanding Professor 2015-2016 with the College of Fine and Applied Arts. She earned her master's and doctorate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research on Women War Correspondents has been recognized for several grants and awards, including those awarded by the American Journalism History Association, Harvard University's Schlesinger Library, the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, and the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at UNC Chapel Hill. She has published research related to women and the media and American journalism and women in health, and she's contributed several chapters to the Multimedia Encyclopedia of Women in Today's World. Before she began teaching, Professor Edie worked as a journalist, writing for local and national publications, including American Demographics, Body and Soul, Concord Monitor, Newsweek, Fortune Small Business, and U.S. News and World Report. And as a side note, Dr. Edie has agreed to come to teach one of my English 112 classes post-lecture, sort of secondary duty that she's willing to do outside of her lecture duties. So thank you, Carolyn, for doing that. And so without further ado, Dr. Carolyn Edie, as part of our lecture series, America's Wars.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking to you all about my work today. I have to correct him in one thing, though, because we are Appalachian State University. I grew up in New England, so my whole family says Appalachian, but you can't call Appalachian State Appalachian without being corrected. I learned that before I went for my first job interview. This is what I'm planning to do with you for today. I'm going to give you a background on my research and talk a bit about the history of war correspondence, and then leading into the history of women war correspondents. And my work goes up through World War II. Although a lot of the concepts and challenges continue to exist today. So I imagine you'll see that as well. Okay? And then I will end with I hope plenty of time for your questions as well. Okay? And this, by the way, is Margaret BurkeWhite, a reporter and photographer who, if you haven't heard, you should look her up. She's quite famous, but I'll be talking more about her. Okay, so how long do you imagine people have been reporting on war? Anybody? Well, first of all, what does reporting mean? Reporting is just telling somebody else about it, right? So people have been reporting on war since wars began, right? But the term war correspondent, as we know it today, really emerged in the 1850s. And according to Philip Knightley, who has studied war correspondence extensively and written the book on, or several books, he died in 2016, but his work is definitely worth checking out if you are interested in war correspondence. So he called the 1850s the infancy of war correspondence. That's when war correspondents became almost this heroic icon. They had this celebrity status. But between the 1850s, between Civil War and World War I was really its golden age. This is where lots of papers were hiring war correspondents, but it was essentially a free-for-all. There weren't very many regulations. It was the golden age where they were celebrities with very few limitations, right? So Frederick Hudson, who wrote textbooks on journalism in 1872, noted that this celebrity status and wrote the War Correspondent, how much would be lost without him? How many noble deeds and gallant actions have disappeared with the smoke of battle for want of a reporter? It's like if the reporter wasn't there, did it actually happen? So, the soldiers, at this point, there was a lot of celebrity status associated with this, and so it's sort of this heroic cause, and it was also considered even at that time the first draft of history. Okay, and this here is William Russell, who's considered the the first, the kind of forefather of war correspondents. So I should back up a second and say that my research began when I was reading through primary materials at the UNC Wilson Library, and I found a snarky remark by a reporter named Inez Raab in one of the collections of Robert Works, who was a novelist. And I looked her up because she was getting mad at him for stealing one of her anecdotes and using it in his column. And I looked her up because I'd never heard of this woman, and she was supposedly the first woman war correspondent, and she'd been incredibly famous in her time, and I hadn't found her written up anywhere. So the more I looked into this, it turned out she was the first woman accredited to the WACS, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. But you'll see that women have been called the first and only woman war correspondent for as long as they've, up through the 70s, even though there have been actually, well, I'll tell you how many in a minute. So I started out wanting to know the history and thinking, well, I'll do the history and it'll just be World War II, and this will be simple because there was one in World War I. Well, it turned out there were more than 60 before World War I. And so that's one thing I discovered, is that just as people have been reporting on war since the beginning of time, so have women. And so what happened between 1846 to 1942, because there wasn't, they weren't the same processes that existed later, anyone really could call themselves a war correspondent. But what was interesting to me, what I looked at, is who were the newspapers and magazines calling war correspondents, right? And so they would label these women war correspondents, and actually they did this to men too, whether or not they were even in battle. So some women were labeled war correspondents during Civil War, and some men, when they were based in Washington, D.C., and not actually seeing battle. So the term war correspondent was a loose, it was really kind of a promotional thing at that time. Look, we have a war correspondent reporting on battle for us. And so some of the women did fall into that category, where today we might not have called them war correspondents. But it was interesting that back then people were calling them women war correspondents. So there were actually it's actually at least 12. I think I was being tentative there. There were at least 10 who actually had military accreditation. There were at least 12 women reporting on the Spanish-American War in Cuba and labeled, each one of them, the first and only woman war correspondent. But actually women, Margaret Fuller was also labeled the first and only woman war correspondent in 1849 when she covered the Roman Revolution. Jane Casno covered the Mexican-American War in 1846 extensively, and she was also called the first woman war correspondent. So there were women writing about war as war correspondents for quite a long time before World War I. Okay, but what was interesting is it's not easy to find these women's writings, because when they were writing and reporting back to the newspapers, a lot of papers at that time had kind of compiled stories. They didn't necessarily have bylines. Where you find these women in the stories is because they often made news themselves. They, and actually I'm getting ahead of myself to the next slide, but the focus was on how, oh, there's a girl at the front, wow, this novelty. But the reason women were writing and had such access to writing at that time was through this category that was called at that time the special. That's what we call today a freelance writer, essentially. Okay, so the special, as they were called, from a journalism textbook, furnishes a broad but thorny road to newspaperdom that's open to all, because anybody, rich or poor, at home or in a strange land, can at least try it. You can write your work and you could send it into a newspaper. So this leveled the playing field for a lot of women who could send their work in, right? So it was the best free-for-all highway to journalism that we have, and there seemed to be about as many women as men who reached distinction by it. So this is how women got their start with this kind of writing, right? And so you had the women who were very connected and traveling and had access to the kinds of stories the newspapers wanted, who were able to get them published this way. Okay, so they tended to be rare individuals, exceptional women. They weren't the normal that you were expecting of that time. They often had an affinity for language, an extensive knowledge of world affairs, access to ways of travel and lots of travel experience. And they did often cover what was considered at that time, maybe still times after that as well, the woman's sphere, writing about the health and feeding of the troops, right? And the community, the civilians in town during war. So a lot of times it was just a matter of being at the right time, the right place with the right set of skills to become a woman war correspondent. And these are two, Clara Bank Colby wrote, she was accredited, and it was a different accreditation process, which I'll get into later, but she had military credentials to cover the Spanish-American War in Cuba, as did Miss Elsie Reasoner. But what you'll see is, and I know you won't be able to read all of this, but when they were written about, which is what you see more often than the news they wrote, they were written about like this. Miss Elsie Reasoner is the only girl who went to the front, which was not true, by the way, with the boys in blue to Cuba. She's only 19, pretty as can be, and has all the self-reliance and breeziness of a girl of Kansas, where in fact this little heroine was born and reared, right? She saw enough war to be able to endorse the famous dictum of the great Sherman, but just missed the surrender of Santiago, leaving Cuba as she did a few days before the capitulation. She will write about the war from a girl's point of view, and her work will no doubt be of peculiar interest. And here, she married another war correspondent. So this story was, you can see that her work was, these women war correspondents, their lives were romanticized. This is 1890, this is actually the article's 1904, but this is when they were working in 1898, and they're writing about her. She's a slip of a girl, only 5 feet tall, just like a china doll. So most of the writing about the women war correspondents at this time had to tell readers, she's still feminine. She's still a girl after all, right? Because it was, pushing the boundaries here. So here is Kit Blake Watkins. She was a Canadian reporter covering the Spanish-American War. And this is an article that ran first in the London Mail, but then it was picked up in the New York Times. And it's kind of a funny article because they make fun of themselves in this article. They're kind of horrified to see a woman here, right? And this gets at one of the trends that I thought was really interesting here, is the definition of a war correspondent. So it started out almost as this myth of this man in battle, and then how are these women affecting that myth? So this gets right to this, because he says, a lady war correspondent, we looked at one another in doubt and indignation. After all, we said, there were limits to the sphere of a woman's usefulness. What kind of a newspaper proprietor would send a tenderly nurtured lady amid the hardships and rigors, the bullets, and the yellow fever germs of a Cuban war? For her own sake, this thing ought to be stopped right now. For her own sake, the unnecessary use of the phrase rather betrayed us. For at the back of our minds, as we lay back on the cushioned lounges, sipping ice water, there was a feeling which we did not care to recognize, that we had a right to indignation for our own sakes. Because everyone thinks they're out there in huge danger, they're actually sitting sipping drinks. And the article goes on to talk about how while they were sitting sipping drinks, she's off talking to all the officials and scooping them, right? Because the thing about covering battle is that sometimes you are in the most dangerous situations, and other times you're sitting around at a hotel waiting, but you're still being considered a war correspondent. But for these men, it's sort of, if she could do it, then maybe it was less of a heroic masculine thing. So you see this right here, and that continues to come back. So this woman, Theresa Dean, she kind of fascinates me. She called herself the widow. She was actually divorced at least twice, probably 3 times, never widowed at all, but she just, that was one of the things at the time, is you kind of rewrote your story to fit society. So she had written about the US military and been labeled a war correspondent and covered battles in Cuba, South Dakota, China, and the Philippines. And I'll talk about the South Dakota battle in a minute. She took pride in her title as a war correspondent, but really she was a special correspondent. And she said, for modesty's sake, because there are real war correspondents out in the field. And this is one of the things you keep seeing, is this idea of what is a real war correspondent, right? So here, she was sent out in January 1891, right after the Sioux battle, and she's sent out as a war correspondent. And the other men war correspondents there really resent her presence. In fact, they don't allow her to be in this photo of war correspondents. And she writes a piece kind of mocking them because they all have guns and they all have, you know, they're all like suited up, and she's just wearing this, you know, wool dress, right? And so she talks about that, and I'll jump ahead of for a second. She just talks about kind of, there was a lot exaggerated about the Sioux Indian Wars, right? And so people were sending war correspondents out in the hopes almost that there was going to be a battle for them to write about. And in this instance, it was more hype than reality. And this here is Bright Eyes. And she was a Native American woman reporter. She also was quite a speaker on the circuit as well, talking about Native American rights at that time. And her husband was an editor. And she and her husband were actually, they were really upset because they were called war correspondents and sent to this. And they recognized that at the time, it was more the hope of there being a war, you know? And so one of the things that's in my notes that I'm going to have to try to remember it because I can't see my notes from here, as it turns out. So she and Tibbles, her husband, went out there, and they were talking about the fact that there really weren't battles to be reporting on, and they were staying with the people, and they were writing these real stories. Meanwhile, these war correspondents were actually writing more exaggerated fiction, and they talked about that. So she was dubbed a war correspondent, but she wasn't really happy with that term, again, because it was exaggerating the conflict. Okay, let's see. So the woman's angle of war, a lot of these women were reporting, as I said, on what was considered the woman's sphere. And at this time, this was considered topics on the living conditions, although the living conditions really actually matter to everybody, whether you're a man or a woman, how you're living, right? So a lot of their articles on the Red Cross and the care and feeding of the troops actually had quite an impact. But what happened was because these were women, they were able to write this woman's angle, newspaper publishers started to see the commercial side of this, right? So women were considered the people making the decisions in the home. So beefing up the copy on the women's pages and incorporating the woman's angle of war seemed like a really good kind of economic venture, right, to get more readers and so forth. But even as this happened, you know, so there's mixed feelings at this time about women writing about war. And here you see a Saturday Evening Post article being really snarky. The London Post has sent a woman to Africa. They were covering the Rif War in Morocco as its war correspondent. We shall now learn what the women there wear. Right? So they weren't taken very seriously at that time by many people. But newspaper publisher Frank Dallum wrote, well, he was one who did criticize them, saying that women war correspondents were romanticizing war, filling popular magazines with personal sensations, and then they were having incidental reference to monumentous events rather than covering these monumentous events, right? But the Saturday Evening Post saw it differently, and he said the big story of war is never at the front. It's in the hospitals and in the homes. It's largely a woman's affair, and therefore women understand it and are poised to cover it. So he sent about 5 different war correspondents off to cover World War I, which gets ahead of me a little bit. This was in 1910, and the military at this time was starting to write military credentials and a field manual for war correspondents. And here in the Army and Navy Journal, you see an op-ed, and it's one of the few places that I found where people were speaking openly about the fact that women shouldn't be war correspondents, their view of this. So at this time, you have a lot of people who feel this view, but I was surprised at how often I could find it written down, right? And here they talk about the author of this op-ed. It did not have a byline, but talks about peace societies are going to spring up everywhere. You know, war is going to become a woman's business if we let all these women do this. And when a woman sees another woman doing something, she wants to do it too. So this is going to be a dangerous enterprise if we let women write about war, right? Nonetheless, when the Field Regulations Manual was written in 1914 and included clauses for war correspondents, it did not talk about sex as a factor. Now, that's not quite as remarkable because they made it so difficult for anybody to become a war correspondent and you had to have the credentials, you had to have the qualifications, experience, and the backing of a newspaper to send you, right? So it was more access for some people, but also many more limitations. And then here, there was a huge difference, again, between a bona fide war correspondent, what's a real war correspondent, and what is a person who's just being billed as a war correspondent by their publication, right? But this applied to men and women, which I think is important to note, because, let me get back to that in a minute. There, only 40 were officially accredited in World War I. There are more than 1,000 who were billed, not just billed, but recognized by the military as having a certain kind of credential, but they weren't officially accredited. You had to have your publication put up a lot of money for you. It was a crazy process, right? And that only 40 got through, okay? So here, this is taken right from the field manual. You can see here that they had to give an account of their career, they had to attest to trustworthiness, but they had to give a bond of about $10,000, I think it was, I'm forgetting right now, I think it was about $10,000. It was a crazy amount of money for that time as well. And then they had to take an oath of loyalty and agree to abide in letter and spirit by the regulations. So again, only 40 people got through this. But about 1,000 had military credentials, and 25 of those were women, many of whom nobody's written about. And there was one woman who, do I have her right there? Peggy Howe. Peggy Howe, I read over and over again that she was the first and only woman accredited in World War I, right? But she was quite the performer. She created her own military outfit before she ever gained accreditation. She actually gained accreditation probably the last week of the war, so she never actually used it. But she was a great war reporter, and she did quite a lot. But my point is she brought attention to herself, and she's who we remember today. Whereas this woman here, Cecil Dorian, I got this out of a U.S. Army signal collection. I have never really seen her written about anywhere. First of all, Cecil at the time was a man's name. It was her father's name, and it was her name. And in her archival collections that are housed at Stanford, there's not a single photograph of her. I think she was very shy to photographs. And I actually found this, and I was very excited, but she was an incredible reporter for World War I for the Newark Daily News, and none of her clips ran as girl at the front. They were all just straight news reporting. Other than Peggy Howe had news, but it was also always billed and promoted as this woman at the front, right? And Cecil was one of these 25 who were recognized, and Peggy Howe was not, there were 18 who were recognized as those who had served the longest as war correspondents during World War I. Peggy Howe, who everyone knows today, was not one of those. Cecil was. So, and this here is Helen Kirtland. And you can see they accepted Mrs. Kirtland's credentials and showed her every inch of the battlefield. So, you know, there's this disparity between who was accepting of it and who wasn't. So I'm going to jump ahead now to World War II, okay? And this is Helen Kirkpatrick, and this is Lee Carson, and they're sitting here in France with a bunch of male war correspondents. So you have the kind of continuing, you've got women who are writing the woman's angle, and you have women who are working alongside men as war correspondents. When we weren't engaged in battle officially, they were considered foreign correspondents, right? So in 1941, you had a lot of women like Dorothy Thompson here who were really well-versed in covering foreign affairs. They were brilliant reporters, brilliant writers. And this, John McNamara, this is written for a children's book on war correspondence, and it describes Dorothy Thompson as being willing to play men's roles. Okay, but that actually, you know, that's kind of a funny thing, but it actually was very true of some of these women who started out as war correspondents. Helen Kirkpatrick, and I'll explain that in a minute because there was a set of women's rules, so I'll explain that in a minute. Helen Kirkpatrick, you can see here, Chicago Daily News is billing her along with all of these men as their best war correspondents. And other than her picture and her name, there's no indication that she is any different than the rest of these. And she never covered the woman's angle, okay? And in fact, in a news conference with Eisenhower, Raymond Daniels is giving this, kind of giving his complaints from the Association of War Correspondents that some of these war correspondents aren't being given enough access. And Helen Kirkpatrick says, what are you talking about? I have perfect access. They're just whining, you know? And it's an interesting thing because she's saying that she, you know, you're expecting to hear, oh, I'm a woman, I'm not getting access. She's saying, look, if they're doing their jobs right, they have access. And there's no, in any of her documents here, you wouldn't know that she was different at this time than other war correspondents. And again, she's saying, I have access to these facilities and these people. And okay, and you can see here, these were ads that the Chicago Daily News ran nationally. Okay, and this is her here, Helen Kirkpatrick. So in 1941 and 1942, you didn't have very many women war correspondents, but those you did have had really worked hard to get where they were, and they were the exceptional women, but also just exceptional reporters. They were exceptional human beings, right? And so they rarely acknowledged the existence, as I gave you the example of Helen Kirkpatrick, of having any terms different. I'm sure and I know they faced discrimination, but they continued to act as though they were just the others and try to kind of fit in. And that becomes important later. So they were exceptional individuals versus just exceptional women. So here, Margaret BurkeWhite was one of them. She had asked to accompany a combat mission, and she had been denied. But then they sent her over on a ship. The ship was torpedoed. She took a lifeboat to land, and as the story goes, she wasn't even dry when she was granted permission to go on the combat mission. And then it ran as a front page story, Life's BurkeWhite. Not woman goes, but Life's BurkeWhite, and she reported on this. And so her reporting was taken just as seriously, as far as I can see, as the men's at that time. Okay, but then what happened was in 1941, the OWI, which is the Office of War Information, sets up a public relations office with the public relations director, Oveta Kulphabi. And she is in charge of the women's interest section. And they're trying to get more women involved as part of this total war. If women are writing about it and they're talking about it, then maybe mothers will feel better sending their sons over. It'll be better for morale. So they start looking at, pushing this woman's angle of war, okay? So and then they were hoping to overcome the peace talk of the last 20 years and get everybody on board with war. That's where Inez Robb comes in and Ruth Cowan. They are accredited as the first two to cover the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. So they go with the women to North Africa. And so they write their stories about what it's like putting makeup on at the front, and how do you stay blonde at the front, and all of these like kind of silly stories. And within the stories are the real, there are some like hints toward the real fears that they faced and so forth. But one thing that I think is interesting is, again, Inez Robb. Nobody seems to know her today, and I've written about her a lot, and I've done a lot of research on her, but she died, I think I'm sorry that I'm always forgetting dates, which is terrible for a historian, but she died in either the late 60s or early 70s, before this real push to start looking at women's history. And so it's interesting to me, as a historian, how many stories we kind of forget, and how the people who are around to promote themselves, those are often the people we remember. At the time, she was the highest paid, one of the highest paid reporters in the world at that time. She was working for International News Service. She had a column. She was very much a celebrity. And she was sent to North Africa. And Ruth Cowan, who is remembered today, who lived a much longer life, was kind of new to reporting, right? And so here is Inez. They have a cartoonist drawing, these pictures about a woman at the front and everything. And so they were great reporters, but they were not international reporters. They were not war reporters, military. They didn't have any of that experience that would normally qualify someone for a war correspondent. They were just women, and they were reporters. So they were exceptional women who were, and again, they were exceptional reporters, but they weren't exceptional war reporters. And so the stories that ran were all woman war correspondent, woman at the front, and that was the focus, right? And the danger was that as more and more of these women became accredited, they became to be seen as epitomes of all the rest. Like, oh, so I'll show you. So, but let me back up for a minute. So what was interesting too about Inez is she never let on to having faced discrimination. But there are all of these letters that I got from an unprocessed collection in Idaho where she is railing on Eisenhower for the discrimination and how they were not treated properly as war correspondents there. So they were, even though they were brought over to cover the women's angle, there were a lot of reporters there who really resented their presence and didn't feel like there should be women at the front at that time. So here is a look at, in 1944, the military official accreditation still did not dictate that sex was a factor for war correspondents. And they didn't have anything officially written down saying women can only go to these areas, they can only do these things, right? However, unofficially, as you just saw, as I just showed you with the letter with Inez Robb, there was quite a range of experiences women were facing. There were certain units that were known for being really discriminatory and others that were really helpful to women, okay? And so what happened was SHAEF sent out a letter. SHAEF, the kind of headquarters, sent out the letter for, to all the different military units asking them about their policies toward women, okay? And they realized that it was this hodgepodge that some were saying, we follow the guidelines, we let them, as long as they have accreditation, they're a war correspondent, we follow it this way, right? Others would say, well, we can't furnish the accommodation or facilities because they're women, where are they gonna go to the bathroom? They're women, they can't go outside. We don't have special toilets for them, so they can't do this. So you had all of these different policies, right? And, but what happened was, so they decided to make this, to have an addendum or amend these regulations. And they say that it's a matter of special facility. They revise the directives. They create this new category for women war correspondents that had never existed before. But what happens is you have these war correspondents, very few, but like Helen Kirkpatrick, Martha Gellhorn, Iris Carpenter, who had been traveling at the front, who were very well trusted by military officials, who were suddenly being curtailed because now they are like all the other women, right? So where you have some women who are off writing like fashion stories about fashion in wartime in Paris, they're now being lumped together with Helen Kirkpatrick and Martha Gellhorn. So what that does is then, whereas these women before were saying, we have no discrimination, we're no different than the men, they're saying, they're fighting on behalf of all women, and they have the power and the clout to do that. So this regulation, in June 1944, matter of special facility, was not actually very long-lived. So this is a kind of a rundown of what I just said, but they surveyed the individual policies, the directives, they found all this ambiguity, and so they created this new category, but then once the women stood up for this, the directives essentially disappeared, and so did this category, right? So by the end of the war, once the war is over, they can, there's less concern about this, so it kind of just disappeared. It wasn't anything necessarily official, and if you follow women forward, it all came back right after this. You had women, it's kind of like they keep going forward and backwards with their rights here. But right after the War Department recognized correspondents for their service by giving them campaign ribbons, and they did not qualify, oh, you're a man and you're a woman. There was everybody was recognized for outstanding and conspicuous service if this committee felt like they had done so. And so in the initial list, it had 27 women and 278 men, and I think it was about 5 times that by the time they actually did the list and they got names from everybody. But in addition to that, the Medal of Freedom was given to 11 war correspondents and 1 woman, one of whom was a woman, Helen Kirkpatrick. So I found it very interesting the way that there was a category of war correspondents, and then within that was essentially a category of woman war correspondents. And most people who write about this do not differentiate between whether this woman was over there covering the woman's angle or the battle, and part of that is it's an incredible risk to take to go over there. And so you don't want to diminish someone's service either, because both reporters were serving in certain ways, in different ways. Okay. So let's see. Oh, but quickly, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. So at the end of the war, though, you also start having men who are saying, I'm not a war correspondent, I'm a combat correspondent. So as war correspondents sort of started bringing in all these groups, you started having reporters wanting to differentiate to say, I'm an actual war correspondent here. There's a lot. One of the things with my book is I was really just trying to get the record straight and figure out what are the regulations, how was the military talking about this, and so that was my goal with this book. But one of the things that was most, sort of frustrating and exciting were all of these incredible individual stories that at the end, I wanted to go chasing down. And actually, the whole process might have been faster if I didn't continually go down all those rabbit holes. But there's a lot of interesting stories. I think here on the right is Betty Murphy. She was the only that I found. I also found that you should never really say first or only, because it's the only one you know of. But as far as I could tell, she was the only black woman who was accredited as a war correspondent. However, she got sick. Right when she got to London, she came down with the flu, and she never actually got to, she got greeted by GIs, and she was written up and featured in all these photographs as a woman war correspondent and given glory that way, but she actually never got to work as a war correspondent. So I think, I'd love to look more into there's just so many new research questions, I think, that come out of this. So, and the other thing is there were there were a lot of couples who were war correspondents together, and I thought that was kind of interesting, too. And if you are interested in learning more about war correspondence, these are 3 books I'd recommend. This one here, this tells you all the really interesting things. Like whenever I tell people I write about women war correspondents, they're like, oh, they should make a movie. I'm like, no, my book is not like that kind of book. The really interesting, exciting stories about the harrowing adventures and the relationships on the battlefields, everything, I didn't mean to go there, is in this book here. And she interviewed all of these women, and she has these fascinating stories, whereas I focus more on the process and all the things I just talked to you about. And then here, Philip Knightley, he has written, this is a wonderful history of war correspondence. And Michael Sweeney has done a great job talking about the military and the press and the different relationships and how precarious that can be. So, good. And so, does anybody have any questions for me?
I think I'd like to hear something about the idea of just a general question of journalism, objectivity and subjectivity, and how possible, if possible, is objectivity. And then perhaps you could say something in your research about gender and how that might play into subjectivity. Is there more of a subjective reporting that you describe as feminine, even if it's written by a man or woman? And then on the other side, is there sort of a masculine subjectivity?
Well, let me think about that for a minute. So for objectivity, that's an age-old question, and there are so many books on this. And and I have to, as I teach journalism at Appalachian State, I have to work with my students. We are always being subjective. We are making decisions. Who do I interview? Who do I avoid? Who do I quote in the article? How do I frame the article? So it's probably impossible to achieve perfect objectivity. We're humans. We have feelings and we have thoughts. The best thing you can do is to acknowledge your bias and then try to work against that and really try to question every decision you're making. Why am I making this? And make sure the answer is because this is what the reader needs to know, not because this is my personal feeling. In terms of, I think it's interesting that you asked that about male versus female, because the first part of your question, in some ways, women did have a harder time, maybe, I'm just speculating here, imagine if your place is already precarious, and you're going to be the one to write that critical article, and they don't want a woman there anyway. So that's quite possible, right? I don't know that I have encountered that, but even John Steinbeck wrote that, we were all liars, because in certain ways, everybody was embedded, and they were in the, if you're embedded and you're also embedded in the cause, you are, our reporters in war were often maybe less objective than they might have been, but they were striving for objectivity, right? The other thing that's interesting about you asking about the two gendered is when I teach feature writing, soft news, the women's pages, about writing about life and all of these things versus, hard news like crime and politics and so forth. People tend to think of the women's soft news as being women's news, the woman's angle. And whenever I start feature writing, I always have a student, actually I shouldn't say this because it's been 2 semesters at least now that I've had this, but it used to be that I always had a student say, what's the fluff? I'm like, nobody should be producing fluff. I don't want anybody writing fluff in my classes, you know? But we have a tendency to think of soft news that way, right? And yet Ernie Pyle gets held up for writing all of these stories and personal stories, you know, whereas when a woman was writing about like the life in the camps and the soldiers, it may have been seen that way. So, so I don't really think that objectivity is a gendered thing, but I think there are ways where it could affect that, so, you know. Yes.
It seems like the irony of it would be that the social historians let women document it in the camps would be of more value to them today. So in some ways, as a primary source, their articles are rich because if they're talking about what's in the sphere, what they do for fun, the kind of foods they eat,
Right.
they make their clothes.
Yeah.
Social historians would rather have that source material. So do you find that in the people turning to these women correspondents to kind of go back and
That's interesting. I think a lot of the social historians are not looking at much at, I mean, that's a good question. I haven't come across that. And I don't know if, you know, when they're looking at the source material, the same people who are looking at the source material are the same people who are thinking about the sex of the reporters, right? You know, so you have the journalism historians that are looking often just at, or they can be criticized for just looking at the coverage. And then you have the historians who may not be looking at who the reporters were. That's a good question. But I also know, you know, again, like Ernie Pyle, there were a lot of reporters who did write about the care and feeding of the troops. They just weren't billed as the woman's angle. So I think that's interesting too. But yeah.
Any differences in the level of access that women's correspondents had, or the location level, types of access they had?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot just depended on the individual unit. Sorry, her name. Claire, whose name is escaping me right at the moment. So General Montgomery was infamous for not letting any women anywhere near them, but I mean near the front, and you know basically sending Claire, whose last name is escaping me at the moment, back to Cairo. But then Iris Carpenter, Lee Carson, several of these women who were aligned with other units where they had the same access as men. So on an individual level, you know, it was very different. But the groups of women who came over through the woman's angle, they were limited. They were not allowed to go any farther forward than the nurses did, right? And that's what I had always read, was that women didn't have access, that they were forbidden. And I wondered, my research question, I started out wondering, well, how did they make that argument? And then if that's true, why did these women have access? And again, the reason is, you know, the military at that time was very hesitant to write sexism down, you know, or racism for that matter. I mean, I think that's what's kind of interesting, is there was all this unspoken, and I went into the records expecting to have like these things delineated. But even, you know, it's interesting that even at that time, you had such a range of what people believed about these things. So you had people who didn't think women had any place there, but they weren't gonna say anything, you know, and then you had men who were trying to, you know, who were treating Helen Kirkpatrick like a colleague. So in that way, it wasn't as different as you might have expected. But I really had started out thinking that because of the way things were back then, it would have just been written down. But you know, that was too politically offensive to write down that women shouldn't have this right. So that was and again, at the it was very short-lived. In June '44 was the only that was the only official regulation I found that ever mentioned sex, and it was basically dissolved a few months after. So, okay. Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. And I do have, if you're interested, this is a site I'm not keeping up with as much as I'd like to, but I've been posting news and so forth there about Women War Correspondents. And so, and you're also welcome if you have questions later. I'm probably the only ED in Boone right now because my daughter's now away at college. But but you can find me through App State's website too. So, okay, great. Thank you all very much.